Subscribe now and embark on an unforgettable journey through time. Across the sands of history, few tales are as enduring and transformative as that of ancient Israel and the kingdom of David. This is not just a story of kings and kingdoms, but of promises made, battles fought, and a faith that would shape civilizations for millennia to come. From the humble tents of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the miraculous escape from Egypt, the foundations of a nation were laid in both struggle and hope. Judges ruled a land yearning for order, and then came a shepherd who became a king, David, warrior and poet, whose courage and covenant would define an era. His son, Solomon, brought wisdom and splendor, raising a temple that would become a beacon of faith. But glory is fragile. The United Kingdom split in two, Israel and Judah, each bearing its own trials, betrayals, and exiles. Mighty empires rose to crush them, yet the spirit of the people endured. From destruction came reflection, and from exile, the seeds of restoration. In this journey, you will witness the rise and fall, the triumph and the tears, of a people whose story became the heartbeat of three great faiths. Stay with us, and let history whisper its ancient truths as we unfold the saga of a kingdom that still echoes through the ages. The story of the foundations of Israel begins in the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where tribes wandered under the endless sky, seeking pasture, water, and purpose. Among them was a man whose life would become a turning point in the history of nations, Abram, later called Abraham. Living in the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, he was called by a divine voice to leave behind his homeland, his father's house, and the familiar gods of his ancestors. This was the first step toward a covenant that would not only shape his descendants but also give rise to a new identity, a chosen people with a promise. Abraham's journey led him to Canaan, a land rich with valleys and hills but already inhabited by various tribes and city-states. Here the promise was renewed. His descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through them all nations would be blessed. Yet the path was far from smooth. Famines forced him to travel to Egypt, conflicts arose with local kings, and there were moments of doubt. But the covenant was sealed through a sacred rite, and the sign of that covenant, circumcision, became a perpetual mark among his descendants. From Abraham came Isaac, the child of promise, born when his parents were old and hope seemed dim. Isaac's life was quieter, marked by wells, treaties, and a continued dwelling in the land promised to his father. Yet his lineage carried the covenant forward. From him came Jacob, a man of struggle and transformation. Jacob wrestled with both men and God, earning the name Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. His 12 sons would later become the tribes of Israel, but their story was one of rivalry, betrayal, and eventual survival. The most famous among them, Joseph, faced the hatred of his brothers and was sold into slavery in Egypt. Through hardship and divine providence, Joseph rose to become a powerful figure in the Egyptian court, second only to Pharaoh. A famine struck Canaan, forcing his brothers to come to Egypt for food. There, after a dramatic reconciliation, the family of Israel settled in the fertile land of Goshen. For a time they thrived. Generations passed, and the memory of Joseph faded from Egypt. A new Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, and the Israelites became enslaved. They were forced into harsh labor, building storehouses and cities, their cries rising to the heavens. It was in this climate of oppression that the next great figure of their story emerged. Moses, a Hebrew child raised in the palace of Pharaoh yet destined to lead his people out of bondage. The early life of Moses mirrored the tension between two worlds, born of Hebrew parents but raised as an Egyptian prince. After killing an Egyptian overseer who was abusing a Hebrew slave, he fled into the wilderness of Midian, where he lived as a shepherd. It was here, at Mount Horeb, that he encountered the divine in the form of a burning bush that was not consumed. The voice of God called him to return to Egypt and demand the release of his people. Moses returned to Egypt, hesitant yet empowered by signs and a mission that would change history. Confronting Pharaoh was no simple task. The ruler of Egypt saw no reason to release a vast labor force, and the gods of Egypt were believed to be powerful protectors of the realm. But the God of Israel, Yahweh, would demonstrate power through a series of plagues that struck Egypt, each one challenging its deities and its rulers' pride. The Nile turned to blood, frogs overran the land, gnats and flies tormented the people, livestock perished and hail destroyed crops. Darkness covered the land and finally the most dreadful plague, the death of the firstborn. On that night, The Israelites were instructed to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, so that the angel of death would pass over their homes. This event became known as Passover, a cornerstone of Israelite identity and faith. Pharaoh relented, and the Israelites departed in haste, their bread not yet risen, thus the feast of unleavened bread. But freedom was not immediate triumph. Pursued by Egyptian chariots, they found themselves trapped by the sea. There, according to the ancient account, the waters parted, allowing them to pass on dry ground, while the pursuing army was engulfed. The journey through the wilderness was a time of testing and transformation. The Israelites, now a free people, faced hunger, thirst, and doubt. Yet they were sustained by manna from heaven, water from rocks, and the guidance of a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. At Mount Sinai, they received the 10 Commandments and entered into a covenant as a nation under God. Laws were given, a tabernacle was constructed, and the identity of a people bound by faith, law, and promise began to take shape. But the path to the promised land was neither direct nor easy. Doubt, rebellion, and fear delayed their entry. A journey that could have taken weeks stretched into 40 years, a generation passing away in the wilderness before their children would set foot in Canaan. This foundational era, beginning with Abraham's call and culminating in the Exodus, shaped the very soul of Israel. It established a narrative of covenant and deliverance, of promise and struggle, that would echo through their later kings, prophets, and exiles. It was the birth of a people whose faith in one God set them apart in a world of many gods, and whose story would influence nations far beyond their own borders. After the dramatic events of the Exodus and the establishment of the Israelites in the Promised Land, a new chapter of their history began, one marked by uncertainty, struggle, and a lack of central leadership. This was the era of the Judges, a time when the tribes of Israel were bound together not by a king or a standing army, but by a loose confederation of families, clans, and elders. Each tribe occupied its allotted territory, handed down according to the ancient divisions recorded after the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. But without a unified system of governance, the people often drifted between faithfulness to their covenant with God and periods of disobedience, idolatry, and chaos. The book of Judges in the Hebrew Bible offers a window into this period, describing it with a recurring refrain: "In those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes." These words summarize the instability that defined the age. The Israelites were surrounded by hostile nations, the Philistines along the coast, the Moabites and Ammonites to the east, and remnants of Canaanite city-states within their own borders. These adversaries often oppressed the Israelites, raided their lands, and imposed tribute upon them. Yet, instead of maintaining a continuous system of defense or a centralized rule, Israel relied on charismatic leaders called judges, raised up by God to deliver the people in times of crisis. Judges were not kings in the conventional sense. They held no permanent throne, had no standing army, and did not pass their authority to their descendants. Rather, they were military leaders, prophets, and arbiters of disputes, chosen at critical moments to rescue Israel from its enemies. Among them were figures whose names would echo through history: Deborah, a prophetess and warrior; Gideon, the reluctant hero who defeated the Midianites with only 300 men; Jephthah, the outcast who led his people to victory at great personal cost; and Samson, the mighty Nazarite whose strength brought terror to the Philistines, even as his own weaknesses led to tragedy. This era, spanning roughly 3 centuries, circa 1200 to 1050 BCE, was not one of constant warfare but of cycles. Times of peace followed by backsliding into idolatry, oppression by neighboring peoples, cries for deliverance, and the rise of a judge to lead them back to freedom and faith. The Israelites repeatedly turned to the worship of Baal, Asherah, and other local deities, despite the covenant that bound them to the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This apostasy invited disaster, for the surrounding nations saw Israel's disunity as an opportunity to dominate them. One of the most famous judges, Deborah, exemplifies the unique nature of this leadership. As both a prophetess and a judge, she sat beneath the palm tree of Deborah, settling disputes among her people. When the Canaanite king Jabin and his commander Sisera oppressed Israel, it was Deborah who summoned the warrior Barak and assured him of victory if he obeyed the Lord's command. Their triumph at the Battle of Kishon River not only broke Canaanite power but also inspired the Song of Deborah, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Hebrew poetry, celebrating the deliverance of Israel. Gideon's story, too, reflects the fragility and faith of this time. Initially a man hiding from the Midianites, he was called by God to lead a revolt. Yet, he doubted his own abilities, asking for repeated signs: the famous fleece that was wet with dew while the ground was dry, and then dry while the ground was wet. When he finally obeyed, he led a mere 300 men armed with trumpets and torches against a vast Midianite host, and by divine intervention the enemy fled in confusion. But even Gideon, after victory, refused to make himself king, declaring, "The Lord will rule over you." Samson, perhaps the most legendary of the judges, symbolized both the potential and peril of this era. A Nazirite from birth, set apart for God's service, his unmatched strength came from his uncut hair, a symbol of his vow. He harassed the Philistines with daring feats, slaying 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey and carrying off the gates of a city on his shoulders. Yet, his impulsive nature and weakness for forbidden love, most famously with Delilah, led to his capture, blinding, and eventual death as he pulled down the pillars of the Philistine temple, killing himself and his enemies in one final act of vengeance. The period of the Judges, for all its heroics, exposed the dangers of a decentralized society. Without a king or permanent leadership, Israel was vulnerable not only to foreign oppression but also to internal decay, tribal rivalries, civil wars, and moral corruption. The infamous story of the Levite's concubine and the civil war against the tribe of Benjamin revealed just how far the people could fall when everyone did what was right in his own eyes. As the era drew toward its close, a new yearning arose among the Israelites. They began to look at the nations around them, nations with kings, armies, and established systems of governance, and wondered whether they too should have a monarch to unite them. The spiritual authority of the judges was respected, but it lacked permanence. Prophets like Samuel, who emerged as the last and greatest of the judges, could lead and guide, but they could not provide the stability that a hereditary monarchy seemed to promise. Samuel himself was a pivotal figure, bridging the time of the judges and the dawn of kingship. Born to a barren woman, Hannah, as an answer to fervent prayer, Samuel was dedicated to the Lord from childhood and raised in the house of Eli the priest at Shiloh. As a prophet, he called Israel to repentance, led them in battle against the Philistines, and acted as judge over the people. Yet, when the elders of Israel came to him and demanded, "Give us a king to judge us like all the nations," Samuel was grieved. He warned them that a king would bring burdens, taxes, conscription, and potential tyranny, but the people insisted. This desire for a king was both a rejection of the theocratic ideal, God as their true king, and an acknowledgement of the harsh realities of their world. Surrounded by enemies and plagued by internal weakness, the Israelites believed a monarchy could give them strength, unity, and lasting peace. Little did they know that this decision would usher in a new era of triumphs, tragedies, and divine lessons. The stage was now set for the rise of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the transformation of a loose tribal confederation into a united kingdom. But before that chapter could unfold, the age of the judges had to reach its natural conclusion, a period that, for all its instability, kept alive the flame of faith, the memory of the covenant, and the hope for a future where Israel would be secure, righteous, and blessed. The story of Israel's transformation from a loosely connected tribal confederation into a unified kingdom continued to gather pace. With the failures of the judges laid bare, the desire for central leadership only intensified. Yet, this transformation did not happen in a single moment. It was a process filled with trials, resistance, spiritual reckoning, and political maneuvering. At the heart of this period were figures like Samuel, Saul, and the tribal elders who represented the yearning and the fear of change. The Israelites, weary of cyclical oppression, gathered once more to appeal to the prophet Samuel. Their words were plain: "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Samuel, troubled by this request, turned to God. The divine response was both a warning and a reluctant concession. The people were not rejecting Samuel's leadership, but God's direct kingship. Still, the Lord allowed Samuel to proceed, cautioning him to warn the Israelites of the burdens a human king would impose: taxes, conscription, servitude, and the loss of their tribal freedoms. Despite the warnings, the tribes pressed on, longing for the stability that a monarch might provide. Samuel anointed Saul, a man of impressive stature from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. His appointment was both a triumph and a test. Saul was charismatic, brave in battle, and initially humble. He unified the tribes against their common enemies, the Ammonites and later the Philistines, winning early victories that seemed to validate the people's choice. The land that had once been fractured by petty rivalries now marched under a single banner. However, Saul's reign soon exposed the dangers God had warned of. Success bred pride, and pride bred disobedience. When confronted with Philistine threats and mounting pressure, Saul took upon himself roles that belonged to the prophet, offering sacrifices and disregarding divine commands. These acts, small in the eyes of some, were grave transgressions in the covenantal framework of Israel. Samuel, speaking as God's messenger, declared that Saul's kingdom would not endure. The people had their king, but the king had failed to honor the very covenant that gave him legitimacy. Amid this turbulence, the longing for justice and divine guidance did not vanish. The tribes were slowly learning the price of monarchy. While a king could rally armies and establish borders, he could also oppress and falter. The shift from judges to kings was not simply a political evolution, it was a spiritual crossroads. Would Israel continue to trust in its God, or would it become like the nations it once sought to distinguish itself from? Meanwhile, the Philistine menace grew. The Ark of the Covenant, that sacred symbol of God's presence, had been captured and desecrated during earlier conflicts. It was later returned after plagues struck the Philistines, but its absence had marked a period of humiliation. Saul's leadership was now tested on every frontier. External enemies threatened the land, while internal dissatisfaction began to simmer. Samuel, though aging, did not retreat entirely from public life. He mentored and warned, often standing as the uneasy conscience of a king who had strayed. His rebukes were not always welcomed, and their relationship grew strained. Saul's rashness deepened. His failure to utterly destroy the Amalekites when commanded, sparing their king Agag and keeping spoils for himself, sealed his rejection by God. This act was not merely disobedience but a rejection of the sacred duty kings were meant to uphold. The tribes of Israel now found themselves in an awkward tension. They had achieved the monarchy they desired, but their first king was already faltering. The promise of unity hung by a thread. Saul's victories were overshadowed by his impulsive decisions, and the murmurs of God's displeasure began to circulate among the elders. It was during this decline that a new figure would rise from the hills of Bethlehem, a shepherd, poet, and future warrior. But that belongs to the next great chapter of Israel's history. For now the lesson of the judges lingered. Without obedience to the covenant, no structure, tribal or royal, could endure. The people had wanted a crown to save them from chaos, but only faithfulness could save them from themselves. The transition from anarchy to monarchy, therefore, was not an endpoint but a beginning. The elders who had demanded a king were beginning to see that leadership alone could not guarantee righteousness. The cycle of the judges, faith, rebellion, oppression, repentance, was now playing out on a national scale with the stakes higher than ever before. A king could command armies, levy taxes, and expand borders, but he could not compel the heart of a nation to remain faithful. By the end of this period, the seeds for a greater story were already sown. Saul's reign had unified Israel, but it had also prepared the ground for David, the shepherd who would become king, the warrior who would sing psalms, the flawed man through whom a covenant of enduring significance would be established. The age of the judges had passed. The crown now gleamed upon the head of a man, but its weight would prove too heavy for any mortal alone. Only by aligning the throne with the divine covenant could Israel hope to flourish. This tension, between human kingship and divine rule, would define the destiny of the kingdom for generations to come. As the dust of conflict settled over Israel's early monarchy, the nation found itself in a delicate and defining period. The tribes had endured cycles of chaos, uncertain alliances, and the faltering reign of their first king, Saul. Amid this climate, a new figure would emerge, one who would forever alter the destiny of Israel. His name was David, a humble shepherd from the tribe of Judah, whose journey from pastures to palace, from lyre to sword, and from exile to eternal covenant would become the foundation of Israel's greatest era. The story of David begins not in the throne room but in the fields of Bethlehem, a small town nestled among the hills of Judah. He was the youngest son of Jesse, tasked with tending his family's flocks, learning the rhythm of the land, the sound of the wind, and the call of the sheep. In these quiet pastures he honed the skills of watchfulness, courage, and patience, traits that would later define his kingship. He played the lyre under starlit skies, composing songs that spoke of the Creator's majesty and protection. Yet the world beyond those fields was stirring with unrest. Saul, Israel's first king, had faltered in his obedience to God's commands, and the Lord sent the prophet Samuel to anoint a new king, one who would rule after his own heart. Samuel's journey to Bethlehem was cloaked in secrecy. The prophet carried a horn of oil and a divine command but revealed little of his mission to the wary elders of the town. Jesse presented his sons before Samuel, each one strong and seemingly fit for kingship, but the Lord's voice guided the prophet. Do not look at his appearance or his stature, for the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, Jesse's elder sons were passed over until the youngest, David, was called in from the fields. He was ruddy, with bright eyes and a youthful face, yet his heart bore a strength unknown to men of war. Samuel anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and from that day the Spirit of the Lord rested upon David. While the anointing marked the beginning of his divine calling, David did not ascend the throne immediately. Saul still reigned, though a troubling spirit tormented him. It was during this period that David's path intersected with the royal court for the first time. Known for his skill with the lyre and his soothing presence, David was summoned to play for Saul. His music eased the king's troubled mind, earning him favor in the court while concealing the deeper truth, that he had been chosen to replace the man he now served. Yet the true test of David's courage would come on the battlefield, not in the palace. The Philistines, longtime foes of Israel, had gathered their armies in the valley of Elah. Among them stood a giant of a warrior named Goliath of Gath, whose towering frame and ironclad armor struck terror in the hearts of Israel's soldiers. For 40 days he taunted the armies of Israel, challenging any man to single combat. No warrior stepped forward, and the morale of Saul's army waned with each passing dawn. David, still tending his father's sheep, was sent to the battlefield to deliver provisions to his elder brothers. There he heard the giant's mocking challenge and saw the fear it cast upon the camp. Though young and untrained in war, David's heart burned with indignation. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? His words stirred controversy, drawing the scorn of his brothers and the curiosity of Saul. Brought before the king, David recounted how he had slain lions and bears while defending his flock, declaring his faith that the Lord who delivered him before would deliver him again. Saul, desperate for a champion, agreed to let him fight but offered his own armor, which David refused. "I cannot go with these," he said, "for I have not tested them." Armed only with a staff, a sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook, David stepped onto the field. Goliath jeered at the boy's appearance, cursing him by his gods, but David replied with words that would echo through history, "You come to me with a sword, a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." As the giant advanced, David slung a stone that struck Goliath in the forehead, felling him instantly. Seizing the fallen warrior's sword, David cut off his head, and the Philistines fled in terror. The valley that had trembled with fear now rang with the cries of victory, and the name of David spread swiftly throughout Israel. The shepherd had become a warrior, the lyre player a giant slayer, and the path to kingship had begun. However, with fame came jealousy. Saul, who had once welcomed David into his service, now regarded him with suspicion. The songs of the people, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands," fueled the king's insecurity. Though David served faithfully, playing music to soothe Saul and fighting his battles bravely, the seed of envy had been planted. Jonathan, Saul's son, became David's closest friend, binding himself to him in a covenant of loyalty, yet the shadow of enmity grew within Saul's heart. The next years of David's life were marked by both triumph and trial. He became a commander in Saul's army, winning victories that strengthened Israel's borders, yet also provoking the king's wrath. Twice Saul hurled a spear at him and twice David escaped. Saul's pursuit became relentless, forcing David to flee into the wilderness. From the caves of Adullam to the strongholds of En-Gedi, David lived as a fugitive, gathering a band of outcasts and remaining steadfast in his refusal to harm the Lord's anointed, even when opportunities arose. Throughout these trials, David's heart remained turned toward God. Many of the psalms that would later comfort generations were born in these dark valleys, songs of lament, trust, and hope. His poetry was not mere art but prayer forged in hardship. The shepherd warrior was being refined in the wilderness, learning humility, patience, and the weight of mercy. For though he was anointed, the crown was still far away, and the Lord was shaping him into a king who would rule not by might alone but by faith. By the time this first chapter of David's rise neared its end, the fault lines in Saul's reign had deepened. The Philistine threat remained, the unity of the tribes was fragile, and the people yearned for a leader who could both protect and inspire them. David's name was on their lips, his deeds sung by their daughters, and his psalms whispered by their priests. The shepherd from Bethlehem was no longer a boy. He was a man marked by promise, scarred by pursuit, and destined for a throne he had yet to claim. The twilight of Saul's reign cast long shadows across the land of Israel. His relentless pursuit of David consumed the court and the countryside, draining both resources and trust. The king, once chosen for his stature and promise, had fallen into a spiral of paranoia, consulting mediums and neglecting the counsel of prophets. Meanwhile, David remained a fugitive, moving from wilderness to wilderness, ever near, yet never striking the fatal blow that could secure his throne prematurely. In these years of exile, the man who would be king was tested more fiercely than on any battlefield. David's restraint during this period would become legendary. Twice he had the chance to end Saul's life, once in the cave of En-Gedi where Saul entered unaware, and again in the wilderness of Ziph, where the king slept surrounded by his guards. Each time, David's companions urged him to strike, to claim what had been promised by the Lord. But David refused. "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand upon him." Instead he took only tokens, a piece of the king's robe, a spear and a jug of water, to show that his intent was not betrayal but loyalty, even in the face of persecution. These choices, though morally steadfast, came at great personal cost. David lived among rocks and strongholds, depending on the loyalty of his band of followers, which included men who were themselves outcasts, debtors and the discontented. His family was drawn into hiding with him, and he formed uneasy alliances to survive, even seeking refuge among the Philistines, Israel's sworn enemies. It was in this complex landscape of survival and shifting allegiances that David's character as a leader matured. He learned to govern not only through valor but through wisdom, negotiation and patience. The end of Saul's reign came not by David's hand but by the judgment of war. The Philistines gathered their armies for a decisive campaign against Israel, and the king, bereft of prophetic guidance, turned in desperation to a medium at Endor, seeking counsel from the spirit of Samuel. The prophet, even in death, brought no comfort. He foretold defeat and Saul's own demise. On the slopes of Mount Gilboa the prophecy was fulfilled. The Philistines struck down the armies of Israel, Jonathan and his brothers fell in battle, and Saul, wounded and unwilling to be taken alive, fell upon his own sword. The first king of Israel, chosen and rejected, died a tragic figure, his legacy marred by disobedience and envy. News of the battle reached David in Ziklag, where he had been residing under Philistine protection. His reaction was not one of triumph but of grief. He tore his garments, fasted, and composed a lament for Saul and Jonathan. "How the mighty have fallen! The beauty of Israel lies slain on your heights." The song, preserved in the book of Jasher, mourned both the father who had pursued him and the friend who had loved him as his own soul. It was this spirit of honor, this ability to see beyond rivalry and personal cost, that endeared David to his people. With Saul gone, the path to kingship opened at last, but it was not without conflict. The tribes of Israel were divided. Judah anointed David as their king in Hebron, while the house of Saul, led by his son Ishbosheth and supported by the general Abner, held sway over the northern tribes. For 7 years, a civil war simmered between the two houses. David ruled Judah with patience, strengthening his base, while Abner, weary of the weak leadership of Ishbosheth, eventually turned to David, pledging the loyalty of the northern tribes. His defection, however, sparked bloodshed. Joab, David's commander, avenged his brother Asahel by killing Abner, complicating the fragile process of unification. In time, the northern elders came to Hebron and anointed David as king over all Israel. At 30 years of age, the shepherd of Bethlehem ascended the throne, not through conquest alone but through endurance and faithfulness. His first great act as ruler was to establish a capital that would unite the tribes, a city neither wholly of Judah nor of the north. He chose Jerusalem, a fortress held by the Jebusites, and through strategic assault, captured it, making it the city of David. From this stronghold, the kingdom began to take shape, its borders expanding and its institutions forming under the shepherd king's steady hand. David's reign was marked by both political acumen and spiritual devotion. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, dancing before it with all his might, declaring the city not only a political center but the dwelling place of the Lord's presence. It was here that the covenant between David and God was sealed. Through the prophet Nathan, the Lord promised that David's house and kingdom would endure forever, that from his line would come a ruler whose reign would have no end. This promise, both immediate and messianic, became the heartbeat of Israel's hope. Yet, David's story was not one of unbroken triumph. The very qualities that made him great, his passion, his boldness, his humanity, also led him into grave error. In the season when kings went out to war, David remained in Jerusalem, and from his rooftop he saw Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Desire overtook discipline, and in the shadows of the palace, he committed adultery. To conceal the sin, he orchestrated Uriah's death on the battlefield. But the Lord, who had raised David from shepherd to king, would not allow this deed to pass unnoticed. Through Nathan, David was confronted, "You are the man." The rebuke struck him to the core, and his repentance, raw, broken, and sincere, was immortalized in the Psalms. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your steadfast love." The consequences, however, were severe. The child born of that union died, and turmoil rose within David's own house. His sons, Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah, became sources of grief and rebellion. The most dramatic of these was Absalom, the charismatic and ambitious son who stole the hearts of Israel and waged civil war against his father. David, now older and wearied by years of rule, fled Jerusalem barefoot and weeping as his own child sought his throne. The conflict ended with Absalom's death, a moment that broke the king's heart. "O my son Absalom! My son Absalom! Would that I had died instead of you." Through loss and betrayal, David's kingship endured, but it bore the marks of tragedy as much as triumph. He returned to Jerusalem restored but changed, a man who had seen the heights of power and the depths of sorrow. His final years were spent securing the succession, preparing for the temple that he would not build but his son Solomon would, and singing the psalms that would give voice to the faith of generations. When his time came to die, he charged Solomon to walk in the ways of the Lord, to keep his statutes and to lead with justice. David's life, with all its contrasts, shepherd and king, warrior and poet, sinner and saint, became the measure of kingship in Israel. Later rulers would be judged by the standard: did they walk in the ways of David? His covenant would outlast his palace, his psalms would outlast his sword, and his name would be remembered not merely as a conqueror of lands but as a man after God's own heart. Thus, the shepherd boy who had once sung to the stars of Bethlehem became the central figure in Israel's golden age. His victories had secured the borders, his failures had humbled the throne, and his faith had forged a legacy that reached beyond his own time. In the centuries to come, the prophets would speak of a son of David, a king who would restore justice and bring peace without end. The story of David, in its fullness, was never only about the past, it was a promise etched into the future. After the reign of David came a period of transition and consolidation for the people of Israel. Solomon, the son of David and Bathsheba, inherited a kingdom that was expanding in influence and had already established its foothold among the ancient powers of the Near East. Yet, with this inheritance came challenges: to secure the throne, maintain unity among the tribes, and fulfill the promises his father had laid down for the future of Israel. The story of Solomon begins not just with his crowning but with the path that led him to be chosen as king. Amidst rival claims, especially from his elder brother Adonijah, Solomon's rise was marked by both divine favor and political maneuvering. The prophet Nathan and Bathsheba played crucial roles in ensuring his anointing. When David was old and frail, they reminded him of his promise to make Solomon the successor, and thus in a sacred ceremony Solomon was declared king in Gihon and anointed with holy oil, with the shofar sounding to announce the new monarch. As king, Solomon inherited a realm with growing trade networks, fortified borders, and a central capital in Jerusalem. His early reign was defined by a request that would mark his legacy forever: wisdom. In a dream at Gibeon, God appeared to Solomon and offered him anything he desired. Solomon, acknowledging his youth and inexperience, humbly asked for wisdom to govern his people justly. Pleased with this unselfish request, God granted him unparalleled wisdom, along with wealth and honor that no king before or after would rival. This wisdom was not theoretical, it manifested in judgments, governance, and diplomacy. The most famous example was the case of the two women who came before him, each claiming to be the mother of a child. Solomon's ingenious solution, suggesting to divide the child in two, prompting the real mother to relinquish her claim to save the infant, became a timeless symbol of discernment and justice. Beyond judgment, Solomon used his wisdom to strengthen Israel's position in the ancient world. He forged alliances with neighboring kingdoms, notably through marriage alliances including the Pharaoh's daughter. These unions were both diplomatic and strategic, opening trade routes and ensuring peace during much of his reign. Under Solomon, Israel transformed from a tribal confederation into a centralized and flourishing monarchy. Economically, the kingdom reached new heights. Trade caravans passed through its territory, connecting Egypt, Arabia, and Mesopotamia. Solomon expanded maritime trade with the help of King Hiram of Tyre, building fleets that sailed to Ophir and brought back gold, silver, ivory, apes, and exotic goods that enriched the royal treasury. Tribute from surrounding nations and taxation within the kingdom also contributed to the immense wealth that would define his rule. But Solomon's greatest and most enduring project was the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. David had longed to build a house for the Ark of the Covenant but was told by God that this task would fall to his son. Solomon took this charge seriously. With the assistance of Hiram of Tyre, he procured cedar and cypress wood, skilled artisans, and vast quantities of gold and silver. Tens of thousands of workers labored over 7 years to complete the temple, an architectural wonder of its age. The temple became the center of worship for the Israelites, housing the sacred ark and serving as a place for sacrifices and festivals. Its completion marked a spiritual and national triumph, symbolizing the covenant between God and Israel. Alongside the temple, Solomon also constructed a magnificent palace complex, fortifications, and cities to secure his kingdom's infrastructure. Jerusalem became not only a spiritual heart but also a political and economic hub, attracting scholars, merchants, and emissaries from distant lands. The period of Solomon's glory was not only material but also intellectual and cultural. His wisdom attracted rulers and thinkers, the most famous being the Queen of Sheba. When she visited Jerusalem, she was astonished by the wealth, organization, and grandeur of Solomon's court. Bringing spices, gold, and precious stones, she tested him with riddles and questions, only to find that his wisdom exceeded all reports. Their exchange became legendary, a testament to the far-reaching fame of Israel under Solomon. As Solomon's reign progressed, his wisdom and wealth reached unprecedented levels, yet this prosperity carried both blessings and seeds of future challenges. The king who once humbly asked for guidance now presided over one of the most opulent courts in the ancient world. Gold-plated furnishings, ivory thrones, and abundant treasures filled his halls. His palace, known as the House of the Forest of Lebanon, displayed rows of cedar columns, and his dining tables hosted guests from every corner of the known world. Solomon's court became a beacon of diplomacy. Envoys from Mesopotamia, Arabia, Egypt, and beyond came to pay tribute, seek alliances, or marvel at Israel's advancements. Trade thrived along the king's highway and the sea routes he developed. Copper mines in Edom and trade in frankincense and myrrh added to the wealth of the kingdom. The economy under Solomon not only enriched the royal coffers but also reshaped the social fabric, creating new classes of merchants, artisans, and laborers. However, this prosperity demanded a heavy cost from the people. The massive construction projects, including the temple and palaces, required forced labor and high taxes. While the capital and major cities flourished, rural areas sometimes bore the brunt of this centralized ambition. Discontent simmered beneath the surface, foreshadowing the fractures that would later divide the kingdom. Spiritually, Solomon's reign began with a profound dedication to God but gradually shifted as his reign progressed. His many foreign marriages brought not only political alliances but also the worship of other gods into Jerusalem. High places for foreign deities were built, and the purity of Israelite worship began to dilute. Prophets and priests warned against this, but the allure of diplomacy and the pressure to maintain peace with surrounding nations often took precedence. Yet, the legacy of Solomon's wisdom persisted through writings and proverbs attributed to him. Books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs reflect a mind deeply engaged with questions of morality, the fleeting nature of wealth, and the search for meaning beyond material splendor. Whether penned directly by Solomon or inspired by his court, these texts became integral to Israel's spiritual and literary heritage. The temple he built became the focal point of Israelite identity, a place where festivals like Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot drew pilgrims from all tribes. The Ark of the Covenant rested within the Holy of Holies, and the presence of God, as described in Scriptures, filled the sanctuary in a cloud of glory during its dedication. Solomon's prayer at the temple's consecration emphasized humility, repentance, and the hope that even foreigners who sought the God of Israel would find a place within its courts. Despite his wisdom, Solomon's later years reflected the paradox of power. The very alliances that secured his peace also sowed spiritual compromise. His wealth, while unparalleled, created inequalities, and his grandeur, while celebrated, distanced the monarchy from its humble shepherd roots under David. Toward the end of his life, unrest began to stir. Enemies arose on Israel's borders and internal dissatisfaction grew. Yet, Solomon remained a figure of awe and reverence. His death marked the end of a golden era, one that combined faith, prosperity, and unprecedented cultural achievement, but also left a legacy of complexity and lessons about the fragility of human kingship. When Solomon passed away, he was buried in the city of David, and his son Rehoboam succeeded him. But the seeds of division planted during his reign, the forced labor, the heavy taxation, the divided loyalties between the tribes, would soon sprout into open rebellion, leading to the splitting of the once united kingdom. In the collective memory of Israel, Solomon remained both a symbol of the highest potential of their monarchy and a cautionary tale of how wisdom, wealth, and power, if not balanced with faithfulness, can become stumbling blocks. His temple would stand as a beacon for generations, his writings would guide hearts and minds, and his story would be told for centuries, a story of glory touched by human frailty. The golden age of Israel under Solomon had brought wealth, fame, and a magnificent temple, but beneath the glittering surface cracks had begun to appear. Heavy taxes, forced labor for grand building projects, and the centralization of power in Jerusalem left many tribes feeling burdened and unheard. Solomon's later years, marked by political marriages and tolerance of foreign deities for his many wives, weakened the spiritual foundation he had once championed. As the wise king aged, a shadow grew over the United Kingdom, a shadow that would soon split it in two. When Solomon died around 931 BCE, his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne. The transition was not smooth. Representatives from the northern tribes approached Rehoboam in Shechem, asking him to ease the harsh burdens imposed by his father. This moment was a test of leadership. The elders who had served Solomon advised moderation, urging Rehoboam to answer the people with kindness and understanding. However, the younger advisors, eager to assert royal dominance, counseled him to speak harshly and increase the yoke rather than loosen it. Rehoboam, choosing the reckless counsel of the young men, declared to the people, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips, I will scourge you with scorpions." The response was explosive. 10 northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, a former official under Solomon, rejected Rehoboam's rule and declared independence. Thus, the United Kingdom of Israel was torn apart. The northern tribes formed their own kingdom, known as Israel or the Northern Kingdom, with its capital eventually set in Samaria. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, forming the Kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. The split was not merely political, it was deeply spiritual. Jeroboam, fearing that pilgrimages to the temple in Jerusalem would sway the hearts of his people, set up alternative places of worship in Bethel and Dan, placing golden calves there and declaring, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This act echoed the sin of the wilderness, drawing the northern kingdom into a path of idolatry from its very beginning. Priests not descended from Levi were appointed, feasts were altered, and the true worship of the Lord was diluted by compromise and imitation. Meanwhile, Judah retained the temple and the priesthood, but it was not free from corruption. Rehoboam fortified cities and sought to strengthen his grip on power, but his reign was marked by decline. The once mighty united monarchy had become two struggling states, often in conflict with each other and vulnerable to external powers such as Egypt, Aram Damascus, and the rising Assyrian Empire. Through the reigns that followed, a pattern emerged. Kings of Israel often pursued idolatry and political alliances with foreign nations, while Judah oscillated between reform under godly kings and decay under corrupt rulers. Prophets were raised in both kingdoms to call them back to the covenant, the likes of Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea in the north, and Isaiah, Micah, and others in the south. Yet, the rivalry between the two kingdoms weakened their defenses and eroded their spiritual core. Wars erupted between Israel and Judah at times, though there were also moments of uneasy peace. Economically, Israel was often wealthier due to its fertile lands and trade routes, but politically it was less stable, experiencing frequent coups and assassinations. Judah, smaller and more isolated, had the advantage of the temple in Jerusalem and a more continuous Davidic line, but it too was far from righteous. The division of the kingdom marked the beginning of a long decline. What had once been a beacon of unity under David and Solomon now stood fractured, each half moving in directions that would eventually lead to conquest and exile. The prophets warned that the covenant blessings could not be separated from covenant faithfulness. To abandon the Lord was to invite destruction. In this fractured world, the people often found themselves torn between nostalgia for a united kingdom and the harsh realities of survival. Families were split by borders, trade was disrupted, and the sense of divine destiny as a single chosen nation seemed to slip further into the past. The once great vision of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation was now a memory, flickering like the last embers of a dying fire. As the years passed, the consequences of the division deepened. In the north, Jeroboam's dynasty was short-lived. Assassinations, coups, and shifting alliances became a hallmark of Israelite politics. Baasha, Omri, and later the infamous Ahab rose to power, each leaving their mark, most often for evil rather than good. Ahab, under the influence of his Phoenician queen Jezebel, promoted the worship of Baal, built altars for foreign gods, and persecuted the prophets of the Lord. It was during this dark time that Elijah the prophet appeared like a storm on Mount Carmel, challenging the prophets of Baal and calling Israel to return to their true God. Judah, in contrast, had periods of relative stability but was not immune to decline. Some kings, such as Asa and Jehoshaphat, sought to restore true worship and reform the nation, tearing down idols and renewing the covenant. Others, like Rehoboam's successors, fell into the same traps of idolatry and reliance on foreign alliances that plagued the north. The temple, though still standing, became at times a hollow symbol rather than the heart of faithful worship. The two kingdoms often found themselves at odds, though there were occasional alliances, especially when faced with external threats. One of the most significant of these threats came from the Assyrian Empire. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyria expanded westward, demanding tribute and loyalty. Israel, caught in the crosshairs of regional politics, often vacillated between resistance and submission. Some kings paid tribute, others rebelled, and the people bore the cost in heavy taxes and military campaigns. Culturally and religiously, the divide between the north and south grew sharper. The northern kingdom developed its own identity, with Samaria as its political and cultural center, while the south clung to Jerusalem and the Davidic legacy. Prophets like Hosea portrayed the northern kingdom as an unfaithful spouse, chasing after other lovers while forgetting her true husband. Amos thundered against the injustice and hypocrisy of the wealthy elite, warning that their days of ease would end in judgment. In Judah, the prophets were no less forceful. Isaiah, who lived during the latter days of the northern kingdom, warned Judah not to follow in Israel's footsteps. He spoke of a coming judgment but also of a remnant that would return, of a future king from the line of David who would establish a kingdom of righteousness. The spiritual lesson of this era was clear. Division without devotion leads to ruin. The people had hoped that separate kingdoms might bring relief from oppression, but instead, it brought instability and vulnerability. The northern kingdom, with its fertile lands and bustling trade, should have prospered, but its spiritual corruption undermined its foundation. The southern kingdom, with its temple and covenant promises, should have stood firm, but complacency and compromise eroded its strength. By the 8th century BCE, the writing was on the wall for Israel. Prophets warned of impending disaster if they did not repent. Assyria loomed like a dark cloud on the horizon, its armies known for their cruelty and efficiency. Judah, watching its northern kin spiral toward destruction, faced a fateful choice: learn from their fall or follow them into exile. The story of the divided kingdom is thus one of missed opportunities and tragic lessons. The promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to bless all nations through their descendants, remained, but its fulfillment would not come through political might or divided thrones. Instead, it would come through a remnant preserved, a covenant renewed, and a hope that pointed far beyond the present turmoil. As the prophets lamented, the division of the kingdom was not the end of the story, but it was a painful chapter, a warning written in the history of a people chosen yet wayward, called yet divided, blessed yet often blind to the source of their blessing. The period following the division of the once united Israelite kingdom marked a turning point that would ultimately lead to the destruction of both Israel in the north and Judah in the south. With the splintering of the nation after Solomon's death, the seeds of weakness had already been sown. Political rivalry, spiritual corruption, and foreign interference began to erode the foundations of both kingdoms. While each kingdom had moments of brief revival, the overall trajectory was one of decline. The northern kingdom of Israel, with its capital eventually established in Samaria, quickly fell into idolatry. Jeroboam, its first king, had set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan to prevent his subjects from traveling to Jerusalem for worship. This act established a precedent for future rulers, where the worship of false gods, political expediency, and disregard for the covenant with Yahweh became the norm rather than the exception. Over the course of nearly 2 centuries, Israel was ruled by a succession of kings, many of whom came to power through assassinations, revolts, and foreign alliances. Prophets such as Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea arose during this time to call the nation back to faithfulness, warning them of the consequences of their sin. Yet their calls went largely unheeded. Internationally, the geopolitical landscape of the region was shifting rapidly. Assyria, a powerful and aggressive empire to the northeast, was expanding its influence. Through the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Assyria's dominance grew, and its kings began demanding tribute from neighboring states, including Israel. Some kings of Israel paid this tribute to avoid destruction. Others rebelled and sought alliances with Egypt or Aram Damascus. These shifting alliances further destabilized the region. Internal corruption, heavy taxation, and oppression of the poor also weakened the social fabric of Israelite society. The prophetic voices warned that injustice and idolatry would invite divine judgment, but the ruling elites largely dismissed them. The turning point for the northern kingdom came in the late 8th century BCE. King Hoshea, the last ruler of Israel, initially paid tribute to Assyria but later conspired with Egypt in an attempt to throw off the Assyrian yoke. This act of rebellion provoked the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and later his successor Sargon II, to launch a full-scale invasion. The Assyrian armies besieged Samaria, and after a prolonged siege lasting about 3 years, the city fell around 722 BCE. The kingdom of Israel was destroyed, its elites deported, and its population scattered throughout the Assyrian Empire. This event marked the end of the northern kingdom and gave rise to the term, the lost tribes of Israel, as those deported largely disappeared from history as a distinct entity. With Israel gone, the southern kingdom of Judah, centered in Jerusalem, remained. Judah had a somewhat different trajectory. While it too struggled with idolatry and political instability, it retained the Davidic dynasty and the temple in Jerusalem, which served as a unifying religious center. Prophets like Isaiah and Micah arose during this time, delivering messages of both warning and hope. They counseled the kings to trust in Yahweh rather than foreign alliances, but Judah's rulers often vacillated between faithfulness and political pragmatism. King Hezekiah, for instance, undertook religious reforms and resisted Assyrian aggression with some success, famously surviving Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem around 701 BCE, as recorded in both the Bible and Assyrian annals. However, later kings such as Manasseh reversed many of these reforms and plunged the nation back into idol worship and injustice. Manasseh's reign, according to the biblical narrative, was particularly marked by moral and spiritual decay, including child sacrifice and the desecration of the temple. As the Assyrian Empire began to wane toward the end of the 7th century BCE, a new power arose in the region, Babylon. Under the leadership of King Nabopolassar and later his son Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon rapidly replaced Assyria as the dominant force in the Near East. Egypt also remained a significant player, and Judah found itself caught between these two great powers. King Josiah, one of Judah's most righteous kings, attempted to reform the nation and renew its covenant with Yahweh. His reign brought a brief period of revival, including the rediscovery of the Book of the Law during temple repairs, which inspired widespread religious reform. However, Josiah's untimely death at the Battle of Megiddo in 609 BCE, while attempting to stop the Egyptian army, left Judah politically weakened and vulnerable. In the years that followed, Judah became a vassal state first to Egypt and then to Babylon after the decisive Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, where Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians and secured his dominance over the region. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel began their ministries during this tumultuous time, warning Judah of the consequences of rebellion against Babylon and urging the people to submit to what they believed was God's instrument of discipline. Despite these warnings, the kings of Judah, particularly Jehoiakim and later Zedekiah, vacillated in their loyalty. They alternately swore allegiance to Babylon and then rebelled with Egyptian support. Each rebellion provoked Babylonian retaliation. The first major deportation occurred in 597 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, deposed King Jehoiakim, and installed Zedekiah as a puppet king. Many of the elite, including young men like Daniel, were taken into exile in Babylon during this time. The situation in Jerusalem grew increasingly desperate as Zedekiah, encouraged by pro-Egyptian factions, once again rebelled against Babylon. This act sealed the kingdom's fate. In 588 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar launched a final and devastating campaign against Judah. The Babylonian armies laid siege to Jerusalem, cutting off supplies and creating famine within the city walls. The siege lasted about 18 months, during which the suffering of the people became unbearable. The prophets, particularly Jeremiah, lamented the stubbornness of the leadership and the suffering of the common people. Finally, in 586 BCE, the Babylonians breached the walls of Jerusalem. The city was plundered, the temple, the symbol of God's presence and the pride of the nation, was burned to the ground and the walls were torn down. Zedekiah attempted to flee but was captured, blinded, and taken to Babylon in chains. The remaining population was either killed or carried away into exile, leaving only the poorest people behind to tend the land. The destruction of Jerusalem marked the end of the Davidic monarchy and the southern kingdom of Judah. This catastrophe was not only a political and military disaster but also a profound spiritual crisis. For the Israelites, the destruction of the temple seemed to signal the abandonment of their covenant with God. How could they worship Yahweh without his temple? Were the promises made to David and his descendants now void? These questions would dominate the exile period and lead to deep theological reflection, as well as the compilation and editing of many biblical texts. The exile began a new chapter in Israelite history. Those carried away to Babylon faced the challenge of maintaining their identity in a foreign land. They no longer had a king, a temple, or a homeland, yet they were called to remain faithful to their God. Prophets like Ezekiel and later the second Isaiah, Isaiah 40-55, spoke words of comfort, promising that the exile would not be the end of their story. They foretold a return, a restoration, and a renewed covenant with their God. But for the moment, the people of Judah were broken, scattered, and grieving the loss of their kingdom, their city, and their temple. With the fall of Israel already a haunting memory, Judah stood as the lone representative of David's line and the covenant promise. For a brief moment, there was hope that the southern kingdom would heed the warnings that had gone unheeded in the north. Prophets like Isaiah and later Jeremiah spoke with urgency, calling the people back to faithfulness, urging them to abandon their reliance on foreign powers and empty rituals. They reminded kings and commoners alike that the strength of Judah did not lie in its walls, its alliances, or its treasures, but in its covenant with the Lord. However, Judah's kings often chose politics over piety. King Manasseh, one of the most infamous rulers, reigned for decades and filled Jerusalem with idolatry, even placing pagan altars in the temple courts. The moral and spiritual decay was profound, and the cries of injustice rose with each passing year. Innocent blood was shed, the poor were oppressed, and the covenant laws were neglected. Though there were moments of reform, such as under King Josiah, who rediscovered the book of the law and sought to restore true worship, the reforms came too late and too briefly to reverse the deep-rooted corruption. The rising power of Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar changed the political landscape. Judah found itself caught between mighty empires, first Assyria, then Egypt, and finally Babylon. Attempts at rebellion and shifting alliances only provoked the wrath of the Babylonians. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem for the first time, taking away King Jehoiakim, his officials, and the treasures of the temple to Babylon. Yet this was not the end, only a warning. Despite this first deportation, Judah did not turn its heart fully to repentance. Under King Zedekiah, rebellion flared again, influenced by false prophets who promised deliverance and victory. Jeremiah, often scorned and imprisoned for his words, warned them that resistance would bring destruction, not freedom. His message was clear: submit to Babylon and live, or resist and be destroyed. Few listened. The inevitable came in 586 BCE. Babylon returned with full force, laying siege to Jerusalem once more. For nearly 2 years the city endured famine, disease, and fear. Mothers watched their children waste away, the markets were empty, the once proud city was reduced to despair. When the walls finally fell, the Babylonians showed no mercy. They burned the temple, the house built by Solomon himself, tore down the city's walls and carried off the remaining treasures. The royal family was captured, Zedekiah's sons were slain before his eyes, and he was blinded and taken in chains to Babylon. This marked not just a military defeat, but a spiritual and cultural catastrophe. The city of David lay in ruins, the temple, symbol of God's dwelling among his people, was ashes, and the people of Judah were led away in chains. The Babylonian exile began, scattering priests, prophets, and families across the foreign land. For those left behind in the desolated land, sorrow and uncertainty prevailed. Fields were empty, cities abandoned, and the once thriving heart of a kingdom was now a wasteland. Those exiled in Babylon faced the challenge of maintaining their faith in a foreign land. Psalm 137 captures their lament. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion. Yet even in this darkest hour, the prophetic voice did not fall silent. Jeremiah wrote letters to the exiles, telling them to build homes, plant gardens, and seek the welfare of the cities where they were sent, for their captivity would last 70 years. Ezekiel, among the exiles, had visions of God's glory departing the temple, but also of restoration and renewal to come. The exile, though a punishment for generations of disobedience, also became a time of reflection. Without the temple, without a king on the throne, the people began to rediscover their identity not in land or monarchy, but in their covenant with God and the promises made to their fathers. The scrolls of the law and the words of the prophets became their anchor. Families gathered by lamplight to tell their children the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David. Priests and scribes worked to preserve their traditions, ensuring that their heritage would not be lost in the foreign courts of Babylon. It was in this crucible of suffering that the hope of a future restoration began to take shape, a hope for return, for a rebuilt temple, for a king who would rule in righteousness. Babylon, for all its grandeur, was not to be eternal. Prophets like Daniel, who served in its courts, interpreted dreams and saw visions of kingdoms rising and falling, reminding the exiles that empires were fleeting, but God's covenant was not. The story of destruction was not the final word, it was a chapter in a larger narrative of redemption. As decades passed, new generations grew up knowing only Babylon as home, while the elders remembered Jerusalem with tears. The longing for Zion became a defining part of their identity, shaping prayers, psalms, and hopes for the day when they would walk again in the land promised to their fathers. Thus, the fall of Israel and Judah was not merely the collapse of walls and thrones, but a profound transformation of a people. They were broken yet preserved, scattered yet remembered, disciplined yet not forsaken. The stage was now set for the next act in their story, one of return, rebuilding, and the rekindling of the covenant. The fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the first temple marked one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Israelites. But history, even when it seems to end, often plants the seeds of renewal in its ashes. As the exiles settled in Babylon and other parts of the empire, their identity did not vanish, it transformed. The story of return and reflection begins in this very crucible of suffering, when a displaced people started to rebuild their faith, their traditions, and ultimately their homeland. Life in Babylon was not that of perpetual chains and brutal oppression for all. After the initial forced march and the trauma of displacement, many Israelites found themselves allowed to live in settlements along the rivers and plains of Mesopotamia. They worked as laborers, craftsmen, traders, and scribes. Some rose to positions of influence, much like the prophet Daniel, who served in the Babylonian and later Persian courts. Others kept to themselves, preserving the memory of Zion in prayers and songs. The famous lament, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept," encapsulates their emotional state, an ache for home combined with the challenge of maintaining faith in foreign lands. In exile, something profound happened. The scattered Israelites began to reimagine their covenant with God. With the temple gone, sacrifice could no longer define worship. Instead, prayer, study, and the reading of sacred texts gained new importance. The synagogues, or houses of assembly, began to take shape as places of communal gathering. Prophets like Ezekiel brought messages of hope and restoration, speaking of a time when God would bring his people back to their land, cleanse them of their sins, and renew their hearts. The shift in imperial power set the stage for this prophecy to be fulfilled. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, mighty under Nebuchadnezzar II, crumbled under the rising power of Persia. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in a swift and decisive campaign. Unlike many ancient conquerors, Cyrus employed a policy of tolerance and restoration. The famous Cyrus Cylinder records his approach. He allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands and restore their temples. For the Israelites, this was nothing less than divine intervention. The book of Ezra describes how, in the first year of Cyrus's reign, he issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple of the Lord. This marked the beginning of what is known as the Second Temple period. Tens of thousands of exiles, though not all, chose to make the journey back. Many had established lives in Babylon and chose to remain, but those who went carried the hopes of their nation. The journey was long and arduous. Groups of families, priests, Levites, and craftsmen traveled with their possessions, livestock, and sacred vessels that had been returned by the Persian king. The road stretched for hundreds of miles, often through harsh terrain, and it took months to reach the land that their ancestors had left behind decades earlier. What they found was not a flourishing homeland waiting for them, but ruins, broken walls, neglected fields, and a city scarred by war. Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Jeshua, a high priest, led the first major wave of returnees. Their first act was to rebuild the altar of God on its old foundations and offer sacrifices once more. The laying of the foundation of the Second Temple was a moment of both joy and sorrow. The book of Ezra tells how many shouted for joy, while the older priests and elders who had seen the glory of Solomon's temple wept aloud, for the new structure was modest compared to the splendor of the first. This era was not without opposition. Local populations, including Samaritans and other groups, resisted the rebuilding, leading to political tension and delays. Letters of complaint were sent to the Persian court, and work on the temple stalled for years. It was only through the encouragement of prophets Haggai and Zechariah that the people resumed construction, eventually completing the Second Temple around 516 BCE, during the reign of Darius I. But restoration was not only about stones and walls, it was about identity and faith. Ezra, a skilled scribe, arrived decades later with another group of exiles. He brought with him a renewed focus on the law of Moses. Standing before the gathered people, he read the Torah aloud, and the community wept, realizing how far they had strayed from their covenant. Nehemiah, a cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes, also played a vital role by overseeing the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls and instituting reforms to protect the city and its people. The return did not erase the scars of exile, but it transformed them. The people of Judah, now more commonly called Jews, developed a stronger sense of community bound by shared texts, laws and traditions rather than a monarchy or continuous temple glory. They learned to survive as a people even without sovereignty, a lesson that would echo through their future dispersions. Reflection during this time was deep and often painful. Questions of divine justice, human failure, and the promise of a future Messiah permeated their thought. The Psalms of Lament turned into songs of hope, envisioning a day when God would gather his scattered flock from all nations and bring everlasting peace. Thus, the period of return was both a physical homecoming and a spiritual rebirth. The fields were replanted, the markets reopened, and the festivals celebrated again in the city of David. But the people knew that their story was not yet complete. They were now a province under the great Persian Empire, their freedom still limited, their temple standing yet humble compared to Solomon's glory. Yet within their scriptures and traditions, they carried the promise that one day a greater restoration would come. This first section of their return journey paints a picture of resilience, of a nation that refused to disappear despite exile, and of faith that adapted without breaking. From the rivers of Babylon to the hills of Jerusalem, they walked a path lined with memory, mourning, and an unshakable hope. The initial waves of return and reconstruction were only the beginning of a larger transformation. While the altar was rebuilt and the Second Temple stood as a symbol of revival, the community that emerged was markedly different from the kingdom that had once flourished under David and Solomon. Politically, Judah was now a province of the Persian Empire known as Yehud. It was governed by Persian-appointed officials, often with a Jewish governor like Nehemiah, but ultimate authority lay with the imperial court in Susa or Persepolis. This meant that while the Jews could practice their religion and manage their internal affairs, they had little control over foreign policy, military defense, or taxation. Tribute was regularly sent to the Persian king, and the population lived under the shadow of imperial power. Socially, the return created divisions. Those who had remained in the land during the exile and those who returned from Babylon often clashed over land rights, identity, and religious practices. Intermarriage with surrounding peoples became a contentious issue. Ezra, in particular, took a hard stance, urging the community to separate from foreign influences to preserve their covenant identity. These measures, while controversial, helped shape the distinct Jewish identity that would carry through the centuries. Religiously, the exile and return period cemented the role of the Torah and the synagogue in Jewish life. With the monarchy gone and prophecy fading, the written word and the interpretation of the law became central. Priests and scribes emerged as the primary leaders, guiding the people not through royal decrees but through teaching and ritual. This shift laid the foundation for later Jewish religious movements, including the Pharisees and Sadducees. Economically, rebuilding was a challenge. The land had suffered from neglect, and the returning population had to restore agriculture, repair irrigation, and re-establish trade routes. Persian administration did facilitate some of this, as stability across the empire allowed for safer travel and commerce. The Persian royal road system connected Jerusalem with major trade centers, gradually reviving its economy. The festivals, especially Passover, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, and Yom Kippur, gained renewed meaning. Passover, once a commemoration of the Exodus from Egypt, now echoed with a double layer of meaning: deliverance from Pharaoh and deliverance from Babylon. The Feast of Tabernacles became a celebration not only of the wilderness journey but also of the fragile yet enduring shelters the people had built upon their return. The prophetic voice, though quieter, did not vanish. Prophets like Malachi warned against spiritual complacency and social injustice, urging the people to remain faithful to their covenant even in times of relative peace. The expectation of a coming Messiah, a king like David who would restore full independence and divine favor, grew stronger, fueled by the promises found in the writings of Isaiah and Jeremiah. Despite the renewed temple and the reconstructed walls, there was an awareness that this restoration was partial. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, was no longer in the Holy of Holies. Many elders remembered the former glory and wept at its absence. The Shekinah, the visible glory of God, did not manifest as it had in Solomon's day. Yet the people clung to faith, believing that their obedience and patience would one day bring a fuller redemption. This period also marked the beginning of the Jewish diaspora as a permanent reality. Not all the exiles returned. Significant Jewish communities continued to flourish in Babylon, Susa, and other cities of the Persian Empire. These communities maintained ties with Jerusalem, sending offerings and pilgrims, creating a network of faith that transcended borders. As the Persian Empire eventually gave way to the conquest of Alexander the Great and later the rule of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings, the Jews found themselves again navigating foreign dominance. But the foundations laid during the return, scriptural devotion, communal resilience, and a deepened expectation of deliverance, ensured their survival. The story of return and reflection is, therefore, not merely a historical episode. It is a lens through which later generations understood their own struggles and hopes. Whether under Persian, Greek, or Roman rule, the memory of Cyrus's decree and the rebuilding of the temple stood as a testament that restoration was possible, even after total devastation. In the centuries that followed, this period would inspire writings, reforms, and even revolts. It set the stage for the rise of new sects, the codification of sacred texts, and ultimately for the world into which figures like John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth would be born. But at its heart, the return from exile was a story of faith rediscovered and redefined. It was about a people learning to live with loss yet refusing to let it define their future. Their homeland was smaller, their temple humbler, their kingship gone, but their covenant remained. The echoes of their songs, their laments, and their prayers still linger. The Lord has done great things for us and we are filled with joy. In that joy and that longing, the story of Israel entered a new chapter. No longer just a kingdom of the past but a faith prepared to endure through ages of change.